Montauk Project was reportedly a series of secret United States government projects conducted at Camp Hero, otherwise known as Montauk Air Force Station on Montauk, Long Island. It was claimed by a small number of conspiracy theorists to be secretly developing a powerful psychological war weapon. The project is widely regarded by mainstream sources as fictional. My guest tonight, an author of the Montauk Project series and founder of Sky Books Publishing, claims that the origin of the Montauk Project dates back to 1943 when radar and visibility was being researched aboard the USS Eldridge. As the Eldridge was stationed at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, the events concerning the ship have commonly been referred to as the Philadelphia Experiment. The objective of this experiment was to make the ship undetectable to radar, and while that was achieved, there was a totally unexpected and drastic side effect. The ship became invisible to the naked eye and was removed from time and space as we know it. Although this was a remarkable breakthrough in terms of technology, it was a catastrophe to the people involved. Sailors had been transported out of this dimension and returned in a state of complete mental disorientation and horror. Some were even planted into the bulkhead of the ship. Some people claim those who survived were discharged as mentally unfit or otherwise discredited, and the entire affair was covered up. After the war, research continued under the tutelage of Dr. John Van Neumann, who had directed the technical aspects of the Philadelphia Experiment. His new orders were to find out what made the mind of a man tick and why people could not be subject to interdimensional phenomena without disaster. And so began a massive human factor study, which began at Brookhaven National Laboratories on Long Island, New York, and it was known as the Phoenix Project. Tonight, my guest is going to be sharing with us his information and expertise of years of research and study. Peter Moon. Welcome, Peter.
Oh, thank you. It's nice to be here, Hillary.
Well, it's nice to finally touch base and talk and hear your voice in person.
Same here.
Yeah, so where do we begin? I mean, you wrote these fabulous series of books, which I've read through, which they're just phenomenally written, and they have so much information in them, and you go into such a variety of topics. How did you get into this in the beginning?
I was in 1990. I went to seek out Preston Nichols because of his reputation as an inventor. He had invented a machine which was called the BioPhys. At that time, it's now evolved into the Pyramid of Sound. And the Pyramid of Sound, I guess as it exists today, is a state-of-the-art sound system which is designed to balance the energy of the body. That's its purported benefit, but it also is an extension of the technology they were using at Montauk through mind amplification, concentration of mind, concentration of energy, and focusing it and amplifying it. And of course, that's a mini version of what the Montauk Project was. But that's how I got involved. I went to seek out Preston because of this machine he had invented, and I ended up being subjected to a lecture that he was participating in. It was a panel of speakers, and I met him, and he says, you're going to have to talk to me. You're going to have to listen to this lecture because I won't be available till the break. So I listened to the lecture, and it was all about the Montauk Project, and it forever changed my life because I got interested. I sought out more information. I eventually began writing the book with him because I had, writing skills, and that was not his. Preston's a genius, but writing is not one of his skills.
Mm-hmm. And so it was a series of synchronistic events that led you to this, or was it more of an intuitive knowing that you knew you had to get into this topic?
Well, it wasn't. Initially, if you look at the broad overview, yes, there was a lot of synchronicity at play, although I was not aware of it at the time. It was mainly my interest in seeking out his machine, which I was actually, because I was in marketing and advertising, I was seeking out the opportunity to help him do that. I heard he was a prolific inventor who didn't really market his stuff or know how to market it, and I was just seeking him out as that. And of course, when I heard all these stories about the Montauk Project and the Philadelphia Experiment, I was astounded. It was more interesting. I'd been a fan of science fiction earlier in my life, in my early part of my life. I didn't really wasn't pursuing it too much at that point in my life, but I was utterly fascinated with what the information was, and I said, I've never heard anything like this in my life. You also have to understand at that time on Long Island, there was a breakthrough of a lot of information that was in sort of sectors that were hidden from the general public, and it was a lot of it was being espoused in a over the top floor of a health food store in Farmingdale, Long Island, where people would meet and congregate, and there was a lot of interesting people on Long Island they're really obscure. Most of them aren't around now, but they were involved deeply into the study of pyramids, deeply into astrology and metaphysics on a level that you will not find if you go to the metaphysical hotspots of the world, whatever they might be. Sedona is just one, but you found a depth here in people that was rather astounding. And I can only compare it to New York City because I was in the advertising business, and if you went into Manhattan, you learned very quickly that the advertising business on Long Island was cowtown. It was a cow town. If you went into Manhattan to talk about metaphysics, you found out Manhattan was a cow town. It was very interesting. So there was, a lot of heavy information being circulated, and I just happened to tap into it. Having a background in it, I quickly recognized it, and that's sort of how I got involved.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating story, and you share that a lot in your books. Now, I want to kind of just jump into the basics for those listening who may not be aware of what this was about. There was a lot of claims associated with the Montauk Project that had to do with time travel, different dimensions. There was an extraterrestrial aspect to it. There was a lot associated with it. When you started to come across this, I can see why you would say you're lucky that you were a science fiction fan, because a lot of this really sounds like it's science fiction. What was the first piece of it that you came across once you started getting into the research that really hooked you?
Well, I think what hooked me into the story is I had heard about the Philadelphia experiment years before at a lecture, and I think John White had mentioned it, and they were talking about the ship, maybe making a ship and disappear in 1943, and I'm thinking, this is nonsense. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And the girl sitting next to me said, I don't think so. The Navy can do some pretty strange things. I'm thinking, there's a lot of people on Long Island who've heard a lot of weird, strange things. So, I'm not a believer of this. I think it's utter nonsense. When I was sitting in this lecture where Preston participated, there was also Duncan Cameron and Al Bielek, who were claimed to be survivors of the Philadelphia experiment. And when they spoke, you got a very first-hand account. And, of course, their time signatures were witnessed back to that time period in 1943. And when I say time signatures, you could feel the time period of that time if you were at all sensitive. They're talking from 1943. Now, that's not an objective proof, but certainly you can feel their very strong energy. And, of course, these characters were very unusual, very remarkable in terms of not only the way they appeared, but what they were actually saying. It was like there was a leak in the ethers of this dimension, and they were a witness to it. They had been a witness to it. And, of course, this is not – well, the first thing I learned as I got involved in this with Preston Nichols is he says, we discussed doing it in science fiction or doing it as a real story. And I said, well, I don't think it's good to do it as science fiction because it's obvious to me from all the people you've introduced me to and the people I've seen that there's a lot of substance to this story. There's a lot of people that don't appear in the book that were peripherally or not so peripherally connected to this, more directly connected to it, and they don't want to be mentioned. And they've kind of gone by the wayside of history. So I said, there's something to this. And he said, in science fiction, he says, the one thing you got to understand is that science fiction fans don't want their story to be real. They want it to be fiction. Yeah. And while this is not necessarily true of all science fiction fans like myself, who was one, certainly it is true for your more hardcore people that want it to be fiction because it's too unsettling for it to be real. Now, to answer your question of what took me on the story, well, I was hearing all of this stuff, which was utterly fascinating in terms of the theories of expanding the mind so that it could actually literally change time and portals of time, and it was a remarkable story. Nothing like it I'd ever heard. But I remember they were talking about the Nazi connection to Montauk, and Al Bielek saying, oh, yeah, there were Nazis all over Montauk. And I go, what on earth is this? You know, I mean, how do you insert Nazis into Long Island? And then, you know, lo and behold, I would eventually write a book, The Black Sun, about Montauk's Nazi-Tibetan connection, which would tell us that the biggest congregation of Nazis outside of Germany in the 1930s was on Long Island. And it was right adjacent to what is now Brookhaven Labs in Yaphank. And up until the 1980s, you could not live in what an area of German gardens unless you were German, of German descent. And they even had an Adolf Hitler Boulevard on Long Island, which is now Park Boulevard. It's a small little rural street, actually, but then and all the streets were named after prominent Nazis. And in this section, not all over Long Island, there have been people that have tried to wipe out the history of this. They try to say that this never occurred on Long Island. They want to wipe it off of the city records and you know, the town and planning blueprints and all that. And of course they haven't been able to. They say, you can't wipe out history. They said, well, it's bad history. No, you got to remain history the way it is. So this is an aspect of Long Island. And there's a lot more history to Long Island, that there was a very strong presence here. And also, I don't think it's mentioned in any of the books, but Adolf Hitler had a nephew, Willy Hitler, who actually came and worked at Brookhaven Labs in a blood analysis laboratory he had with Brookhaven Labs. And his relatives are still around here. That was Adolf's nephew. So, I mean, so that really fascinated me. First, I said, what is this? And, of course, I've spent a lot of time researching the history of Nazis on Long Island and whatnot. And it's a fascinating element because it's a hidden history. But the more you dig up the hidden history, you find Nazis all over the place of hidden history. What
exactly were the Nazis onto that we wanted so bad? After the war, when we brought them over here and we wanted their what exactly were we after?
Well, there was flying saucer technology, what we call flying saucer technology. They called it VRIL, V-R-I-L, which they were trying to emulate the technology of Atlantis and of what they believed to be Atlantis. And this existed. I mean, of course, this was deep into metaphysical occult societies. The Thule Society and the Vril Society were the sister societies that were run by Karl Haushofer, who was known as the mentor of Rudolf Hess, and some say he's the occult mentor of Hitler. He certainly knew Hitler. And him and his son were very close to Heinrich Himmler. And, of course, it was through the Vril Society that there were these German mediums, Sigrun and Traute were the main mediums. There was also Maria, and they were these Vril mediums. They had beautiful long hair. You can even see some pictures of them. They're not very good pictures on the internet, but they wore very long hair. They looked kind of, you know, very exotic, and they would channel what eventually became this flying saucer technology. And this is one of the most unexplored areas because it's very obscure of the Nazi secrecy. This is actually pre the Nazis taking power. This is in the late teens and 20s, and their technology evolves into, it's being fed to German engineers, which are some of the best, and they evolve this into the Honeyboo spacecraft and whatnot, and that were fledgling at the time the war ended. So they had tremendous technology. Germans have the best technology in the world. So we wanted the technology, and they also had a very deep interest in occult studies. We wanted their money. So there was a great interest because, Martin Bormann was the signatory on many of the accounts, and it stands to reason that Rudolf Hess was still a signatory, and that's one of the reasons they kept him under lock and key. You know, they kept him.
Do you think that the UFO phenomena that was happening back in the 40s with Roswell and everything had to do with these flying discs that were actually government experiments with different Nazi technology, or do you think that it was actual extraterrestrials?
Well, that's a theory that's been suggested, and I've mentioned it, many years ago in the Black Sun book that I wrote. But that's just starting to be, more commonly accepted by researchers now, because that book, The Black Sun, was very groundbreaking in the United States because it showed some of, the first pictures of flying saucers, which were actually given to me by Jan von Helsing, who had gotten them from members of the Knights Templar when East Germany became part of Germany, and they began to release these photos. So, but the theory you say, this is, what I believe is kind of irrelevant. There have been some pretty, a lot of people have been looking at that angle. That yes, it's quite possible that the Roswell craft were affiliated with the team that, that came out of Germany. The team that came out of Germany had to, of course, find a different location when Germany was invaded. And there are consistent reports of them escaping to Antarctica. What is less known is that this is according to my sources in Germany, who I've met with in person and whatnot, and said that, and this is, about 1961 or 62, they had to leave the colony in Antarctica because it was a virus that caught on, or microbe or something, and it expanded, and they had to get out of there. It wasn't healthy. So they went to the Mato Grosso region of Brazil, right where Brazil meets Paraguay. And you see sort of an idealized version of this in the movie Boys from Brazil, where they kind of take a seaplane into the jungle. That's representative of that area, where they continued their saucer technology in the jungles. There's a Nazi base there in the Mato Grosso, supposedly. And there's some lore, but it's pretty obscure. Now, what they had done was they had married up with a group that was called the Marconi Group. Marconi of Italy, he was credited with the invention of radio, although it was eventually given to Tesla, but he got most of the money for it. And Marconi's he was Italian, a very good technician and scientist, and he parlayed his understanding, because he knew Tesla. They were friends and rivals also, and he was supposed to have faked his death in about 37 or so and gone to South America, into this area, and the Germans connected up with his technology. But you got to remember, he was a member of the Axis. He was very fascist. The Vatican were his best friends, and he did their whole radio network, the Vatican radio network, for free. He set it all up for them. So he was a staunch fascist and was their friend. So it would be not, if you accept the idea or theory that he did not die. I can't verify that for you, but it's a pretty consistent theory. And Italy was very advanced in technology in that time period. So, so it stands to reason that there's a group that has remained hidden from sight, that has obviously, the most obvious thing if you study ufology is you see the saucers of the 1950s, and when you see the saucers of the 70s and 80s, you notice that they're so much more modern. And you have to ask yourself, what is it? Did the aliens get more modern, or is it all fake? It's one or the other. Either the aliens got more modern, or the artists got more modern, or they were evolving here on this planet all along. And it would stand to reason that there's also a conjunction of, or a hybridization of consciousness, because people are not just people. They're tied to their ancestors. They're tied to entities. They're tied to spirits. They're tied to all sorts of things. So this is a consciousness. The Roswell events are certainly a consciousness that is unusual, to say the least. And if we take all of the alien phenomena at face value and tend to accept it for what it tends to be, it's highly manipulative.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually just finished reading The Day After, well, I'm in the process of finishing The Day After Roswell by Colonel Philip Corso. And I have found it rather eye-opening, to say the least. And I've researched this stuff for a while. And what I really feel is there's a lot of truth to, is that there was, something found, and that the technology was then put into industry, and we've seen a lot of advances in our technology through the reverse engineering that we've done with these kinds of things. And if we have found one, perhaps the Germans found one, and everybody was trying to duplicate or copy or, do some form of reverse engineering projects that would allow them to do that. But I think that there's a mixture of stuff. That's my own personal opinion on that. But going back to the Montauk Project, Peter, what were we dealing with here? Were we dealing with the Montauk was an outgrowth of the Philadelphia experiment, and so they wanted to really experiment on people to see why we couldn't go interdimensionally? What were they doing? What was their focus? Was it about mind control? Was it about, studying the mind? What do you think their intention really was?
Well, what you have it Montauk, and, really what Montauk evolves technologically, and when we say technologically, I'm referring to the human factor technology, which is sort of begins at 1943 Montauk. And what we have is a effort to make a ship disappear and go dimensional, change dimensional, and the people being subjected to that. Now, there's one of the most remarkable things I've ever heard is to hear Preston. I one time heard him talking to a technical person that I introduced him to. I took him all the way to New Jersey to meet this person, and he was a technical guy who'd worked for the government and whatnot, and they started going into a technical discussion about the technology that was used on the Eldridge, and it was bizarre because it was so detailed. It was very detailed, and you could see that they were really doing something here. It was really strange. When we mentioned the word albeolic, the guy says, "Albeolic?" Yeah. He says, "I know albeolic." I said, "How do you know albeolic?" He hasn't told you about this stuff? No. He says, I grew up with albeolic. I went to high school with albeolic. He says, he never talked about the Philadelphia experiment. He doesn't. I said, he never told you? No. It was a very weird coincidence. We go all the way to meet this guy. He knew Al. But back to what you were saying about how Montauk fits into all of this, the Philadelphia experiment was a hybridization of what you might call ordinary human consciousness with dimensionality. And when you consider dimensionality, whatever that means, it's a measurement of dimension means measurement. So dimension and time is also a dimension. So, there's factors of time. There's different territories, domains. And do not think for a minute that domains are not occupied by consciousness. We can call them demons, we can call them angels, we can call them entities, we can call them what, but you have a different form of consciousness. And a human being in his so-called mundane state is consciousness. So you have him transferring from one realm of consciousness to another. And of course, this can be problematic. If you put a person into who speaks English and only English, and you put him into the middle of a village in Mexico, he's going to have a considerable amount of problems, and vice versa. So that's just one. If you put him into a domain where the rules aren't quite the same, it would stand to reason he's going to have problems. So you're going to have a hybridization of consciousness where you're going to have other entities being intruded upon, and it's been said that by witnesses that there were UFOs that appeared over the Eldridge, and that this really opened up a portal. It's been said many UFOs gated in through that experiment in 1943. Now, these are more in the status of legends, but it ripped a hole in time and space, literally. It was a portal that opened. So basically, what you have in the Montauk Project, which evolves like some 30 years later, where it starts to hit its stride 30 years later, you have a study, you have the soldiers, the sailors who were involved being taken, the survivors, because many of them didn't survive, being taken to Camp Upton on Long Island, which was a convalescent hospital, and then eventually that turns into Brookhaven Labs. Now, which is formed after the war, and at the same time you have one of the major contractors at Montauk was Sperry. Sperry. You used to see their names all over the equipment out there. And Sperry became Unisys, which up until recently, I say recently, maybe 10 years ago, was up in Lake Success, New York on Long Island. And that Sperry was where they had the first United Nations, the first meeting of the United Nations before the big building in New York City was built. So you had, if you take these theories of the United Nations forming to meet aliens and all this sort of stuff, there's a lot of what you call plausible theory, that you have a hybridization of consciousness, entities, and this sort of thing happening on Long Island and eventually at Montauk. I don't know if I digress too much from your question, but
no. It's perfectly, it's all connected. And what I was thinking when you were talking was that I believe it was 1947 that Roswell happened, if I remember that off the top of my head. And I think it's interesting. Yeah, 47. Yeah, and the Philadelphia experiment was said to have happened in 1943, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and so what I was just kind of following your words and thinking about those two connections. But we've had depictions of other entities and other beings coming to this planet that go back to ancient sites. Pictographs all over the place through different cultures that show some kind of interaction with something that doesn't seem of this world. So I don't think it's something that's relatively new, but I think that this hole that they may have ripped open, this portal, do you think that we let something in and that could have been what we did discover at Roswell, and then we just kind of rolled with the ball from there and started to try to use that technology? Do you think there's been a communication between ETs and governments of the world?
Well, if you study governments and political science long enough, and you're reasonably intelligent enough, and you're not, I shouldn't really say intelligent, you're not blocked, you will eventually see that these governments are ruled by secrecy and the manipulation of secrecy and covert groups that are secret. And basically, because you have your groups like the Skull and Bones, like the Bohemian Grove, that the world leaders belong to, but the world leaders will not talk about. In other words, it's a closed club. So, it's a consciousness that's foreign to what you would call the ordinary human citizen. It's loaded in secrecy. And when you're loading and when you're in, this is just elementary intelligence, but most people won't look at it. So you have all these secret factors ruling the politics. Now, when you have secret factors, you're going into a realm of occultism, which means hidden. And when things are hidden, you're going to have everything under the sun. You're going to have demonic entities. Of course, you're going to have alien entities. And all alien means is foreign. It means exotic and alien mean the same thing. It's something that you're unfamiliar with. People think of exotic as a girl, and half-clad girl or less dancing. That's a term that's been marketed to us. But exotic means alien or foreign. And unfamiliar. Doesn't mean it comes from another planet. Doesn't mean it doesn't. But it's foreign, it's alien, it's exotic. So those are the actual literal factors that control our governments, are things that we don't see, mysterious forces.
And so the mind control, the brainwashing stuff that is the legends that are associated with Montauk, were they true? Did they really happen?
Oh, they're much more than legends. In fact, you can find patents for devices that will, literally change the emotions and moods of human beings. It's not even legend. It's just a question of denial. And of course, I've met more mind control victims than you could care to imagine. And people who, now maybe they were at Montauk, maybe they weren't, but certainly evidence of mind control. And if you've spent any great deal of time at Montauk, and I understand you're going to be going there this summer, that you will, you ask right questions and you'll see certain people and, you'll be very convinced they can react quite strongly.
Yeah. Do you think, Peter, that they were doing experiments for larger projects that they had in mind for this kind of level of control of a human being?
Well, I mean, they used human beings for whatever they wanted to. Would they use them for, like in the case of Duncan Cameron, they were trying to use him to literally control consciousness, control animals. I mean, and they're according to the stories and legends, they were trying to literally manipulate time itself. They're trying to harness the powers of creation. Because if you give anybody, any dictator, enough power, they're going to exercise it until they basically discombobulate themselves. And this is what happened at Montauk, according to the story. Now, the story has a lot of story in it. I mean, and it digresses. It has to digress from the truth because we don't know exactly what happened there. It's Preston Nichols' best account of what happened, based upon his experiences and based upon interviews he's had with many, many people who, for the most part, want to remain silent. So you have them creating a portal that's a master portal where you can go anywhere into time. Theoretically, and then it all backs up on them.
So they were experimenting with these psychic abilities of people also, weren't they? So was this a continuation of what the Germans were doing in the concentration camps where these experiments were being put onto these people? This was a continuation of that work in a sense, wasn't it?
Well, yes, because, of course, what they had taken with the captured German documents and all that research that had done with Dr. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. And Mengele had studied midgets, he studied twins, he studied all sorts of paranormal phenomena, and according to the Montauk research, his most prized findings came with twins and their psychic ability. And this was what was worked with, was that sort of energy. And Mengele was a brutal character, but he had a good reputation as a scientist for at least getting at facts. I don't mean that to imply that he was a moral scientist, but as far as getting at facts and what you would call rudimentary empirical data, he was good at assembling it, and because he was ruthless and he had no qualms about doing what he did. So his research was, esteemed by his colleagues, even though it was brutal. And this is what, they used in conjunction with all sorts of other occult studies. And you got to understand about Montauk, if you have all of these people, it's basically being run by entities you don't see. And, there could be a general here and a admiral here and a politician here and a scientist here, but you never really get your finger on who's really controlling what.
Yeah. I think that it's compartmentalized to the fact where you have a lot of different groups, keeping information from each other and competing for information and trying to develop things quicker than others. And so I don't, there's a lot of theories out there that, small group rules the world kind of thing. But I think that there's small groups all over the place that, are all trying to get more money and more power.
Yeah, but nobody really rules rules the world. The world is I guess what you call a consortium of consciousness that we all participate in. Some people have an upper leg when it comes to money and temporal power, for certain, but it's like we're all in this together, good or bad. The prisoners, the criminals are all a part of the collective unconscious.
And so that brings me to my next question, which you talk about in your books also, which I really found fascinating, and it's one of the reasons why I want to come down this summer and see the site, is because there's a grid system, an energetic grid system that's on this planet, and you have basically traced the research to Montauk being connected to Egypt, and I'd love if you would talk about that for a little bit.
Well, yes. After I wrote the Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, in 1992, my next step was to verify were some of these things true. Now, of course, there's a lot of anecdotal information and a lot of people that will give firsthand accounts of this phenomena being true. But I wanted more than that. I wanted the verification that everybody wants to hear. And the paper trail was shredded, was made invisible, understandably so. I even eventually, many years later, met a woman that I knew in childhood who worked in the Navy, and I told her what I was into. She says, "Oh, that's like the Philadelphia experiment." I go, "You know about that?" "Yeah, I know about that from the Navy." She says, "Yeah, all that stuff." She says, "Yeah, they shredded all of that. They shredded all of that." I mean, she knew, and she was like a childhood friend, and so anyway, as I began to explore, what I had were strange coincidences happening, strange elements of synchronicity. And of course, I discovered so much synchronicity that it became the theme of my life, and my further writing career was coincidence. So you see that I was stepping into a realm of, because I was conscious of the coincidence. And of course, what does synchronicity mean? Sync means together. Chronicity, chronos is time together. So if I was studying time with Preston Nichols, I was, wow. And I would eventually learn that synchronicity was an element that would occur with the founder of quantum physics. When I say founder, the one who discovered it and began to set forth the principles of quantum mechanics, Wolfgang Pauli. He was known for strange synchronicities occurring in his realm, which they called the Pauli effect. In his case, they were often quite negative synchronicities, something blowing up or whatnot. And this term synchronicity was coined by his therapist and colleague and friend, Carl Jung, who was a very famous psychologist who fought with Freud because Carl Jung understood the occult. Freud did not have the same viewpoint on it, so they quarreled and they digressed from each other. But Carl Jung he coined the word synchronicity, and he said that it was a word that he used. He called it a poor word or a poor excuse to describe the Tao, T-A-O, the great Chinese word that is the principle of the way, the fundamental truth or way underlying all of existence. But I began to discover strange synchronicities in this tradition, which were perhaps based upon my earlier orientation to studying Taoism and the Tao Te Ching when I was in high school. I had a great kinship for this. And here it is reemerging in my life many years later. But as I discovered all these synchronicities, many of them were occurring through the names Cameron and Wilson. I eventually found out that there were pyramids at Montauk when I opened a book by a man named Wilson, and they said the pyramids Montauk. There was no explanation of these pyramids. I said, well, how come there's pyramids? Why does it say? I looked, there's not a word in the book. It just says the pyramids on Long Island. I then talked to the librarian. She took me to a closed-off section where I saw books on Long Island, and it said that the Montauk Indians were the royal tribe of Long Island, and their family name were the Pharaohs. The Pharaohs of Long Island. I said Pharaohs, and I had pyramids. This became a long quest to discover why there were Pharaohs on Long Island who were the royal tribe of Long Island and Montauk. What is this about? And I would eventually meet the tribal leader, Robert Cooper, who was also a police chief in East Hampton at the time. And then I would meet, he would introduce me to Sharon Jackson. Winona Redbird is her native name. She's the shaman of the Montauk Indians. Eventually I would meet Artie Crippen, Red Medicine, the medicine man of the Montauk Indians. So they have had a wonderful influence on my life. But these Indians, it turns out, that sacred, the land where the Montauk Project occurred was sacred Native American land. And I'm looking this in a book. I'm going, this is shocking. And then I learned that the Montauk Indians were declared extinct by New York State Supreme Court in circa 1909, and the land was taken from them. There was every effort to not have them. They've been declared extinct, yet I know many, many Montauk Indians. They're not extinct, and they've never been, there's no treaty with them. The feds have never had a treaty with them, and any Indian tribe that is displaced and wants recognition has to use their genetic tree or bloodline to prove they're Indians, yet the Montauks themselves are not recognized federally or statewide. The state has declared them extinct, and it's a horrendous injustice, and one that I've been trying to correct for years. So that's what I eventually found. And of course, when you're dealing with Native American energy, these people were the custodians of the morphogenetic grid, the consciousness, and they had a role to play. And they recognize that as sacred ground. The medicine man has taught me that the word Montauk in their language means the highest expression of the divinity, the highest. And of course, in ordinary language, Montauk means mountain or high point. It can mean other things, but its most divine expression is the highest expression of the divinity. And so it would stand to reason that if you take the powers of the divinity and you skew them, screw around with them, this is what Montauk became. It became the nadir. It became the inversion of the divinity.
So it's a very sacred place that's been scammed out of the Native Americans' hands, basically, is what you're saying. And why would the government want that site? Why would they want to build a facility that, it goes underground and is there on that particular site? What do you think?
Well, when you study things like the Philadelphia experiment, the Montauk Project, and even things like Roswell, which I can't really speak on because that's not my expertise, but any of these, Area 51, you will see multi-levels of intrigue and, conspiracy, like sort of like if you were studying the game of baseball and every player had an affiliation to a secret government, a secret echelon of the military and a secret echelon of secret societies, that's the kind of what it is. So there's many levels to this. Now, the most ostensible reason they would want to use Montauk is because of the big radar dish they had out there, which was huge and could broadcast frequencies across a wide span of people and could be used for an experiment. It was also ran at the frequency of what is considered the window to the human consciousness, stated in the book as 435 megahertz. It might be a little bit different in actuality, but that's the more or less general frequency, the window frequency to the human consciousness, which is also the background frequency to the Milky Way, which has been determined through the science of astronomy. So that's not Montauk-centric, that's astronomical-centric. But anyway, so that was the most obvious reason, was the SAGE radar site they had out there. But on a deeper level, on a political level, Preston told me when I came up with this discovery, Preston Nichols, my co-author, he says, well, yes, this is typical. They will often use Indian reservations or Native American grounds because if the government does anything on those grounds, they're not answerable to the population because it's technically being done on a reservation. It's not United States of America per se. So in other words, it's a legal loophole that they do to get them out of legal liability. And if they're doing it under a secret code, it's not really the Air Force per se. then it protects them even further from legal liability. Well, this occurred on a reservation. It was not being done by the Air Force. It was not being done by it's being done by some sort of special black ops project. Go ahead.
Well, I'm wondering because, the hyperspace accessibility that was opened up because of these experiments, I'm wondering if because of the grid patterns, because of the Earth grids, at the crossroads of those grids, like latitude and longitude lines, would that increase what they were doing? Would that increase those kind of experiments? Would it enhance them in some sense from an occult perspective? And is that what they were looking for?
Well, when you have ley lines, these are basically juxtaposed with, it could be underground and invisible, where you have rivers, where you have one strata of rock combining with another strata of rock, or to create an electromagnetic fluctuation in. So there's literally, when you talk about an energy point, there's real energy. This is not imaginary. Mm-hmm. It's real energy. And energy will flow. Like, just why does energy flow through the body? Why does blood flow this way? Why did your veins form this way? It flowed in a certain direction because it was directed to flow in a certain direction. And it was directed to flow in that direction because of the way the physicality was. So when you're talking about energy of the planet, it flows along certain lines, and you might see crystalline structures. This has been studied. So what you have at Montauk is a ancient mountain. It's different than the rest of Long Island. It's not really a part of Long Island per se. Geologically, it's, there's bedrock there. It's whereas a lot of Long Island is a sandbar, and it's just goes really deep. You're not allowed to dive off there. Skin diving is not allowed. There are supposed to be great tunnels under the water. Mm-hmm. And that lead, it's an ancient cliff. It's an ancient, according to the medicine man, that they had cave dwellers living there in ancient times.
Yeah, and there was reports of submarines going into that, the underground base, that they had basically built ways for submarines to go in and out of there, and for wartime purposes and other things. Now, this hyperspace, what is hyperspace? What does that term mean?
Well, it depends on who's defining it, of course, but hyper is above. Hyper is like metaphysics means above physics. Hyperspace means above space. It's a space that's a priori or senior to the space we normally consider space. So it's any space really that's not our space. When I say our space, I mean three-dimensional space. That's really all it is. And of course, if you look at time from a broader scale, you can lay space and time out on a grid. Mm-hmm. Where space goes one way and time goes another way. And when you lay it out geometrically, you can put dots and lines, and you have algebra, and it all conforms to algebra. I learned this from Dr. David Anderson, who's our leading time scientist in the world today. And, it basically, time, you can go backwards or forwards in time because you can put it on a graph. And he's learned this. He's learned this maybe the hard way, maybe the easy way, through a equation called the space-time interval, and you can study the space-time interval and learn the secrets of the fundamental, fact that time and space can go forwards and backwards. So all this stuff is existing simultaneously. Mm-hmm. If you can go backwards in time, it's just like walking backwards on a gridiron of a football field. You can see it. You can go back into it. Go ahead.
Yeah. In our last 5 minutes of the show, Peter, I'm wondering what your opinion is on the vast amount of information out there. How some people, what I notice happens to some people sometimes is they get caught in kind of like a never-ending maze that never really takes them anywhere. And they just kind of wander through these different theories and go on and on and on without ever really producing anything out of it. You know, you've done so much work in this field, and your books really go from one place on into many, many other places, which really cover a tremendous amount of information. And you do it in a way that really brings the reader from point A to point B with some serious understanding. What do you say to the people who are out there kind of floating around in these topics? You know, what would be your advice to somebody who tends to get lost in these topics because there's disinformation out there, there's multiple theories out there, you have people, you know, theories conflicting with each other, and
there's too much information. There's too much information out there. So what I learned at a pretty young age was that when you have information or data, you have to know how to approach the subject of data. You have to take data and understand what data is going to help you and what data is not going to help you. It's basically knowing how to analyze data, knowing what data is relevant. And I dismiss so much information, and it's not that the information is not true. It may be wacky, and I may reject it because it's too wacky, but that doesn't tell me I don't pronounce a judgment that it's not true. It's just wacky. In other words, it's not going to correlate anything. So when you seek out information, you want information that is relevant. Relevance is a key. And that's, you know, relevance and relativity. You know, what is it relative to who you are and what you are? And you have to be directed in what you're doing. I mean, there's all this stuff about aliens and UFOs. And I've co-authored a book with Preston, Encountering the Pleiades and Inside Look at UFOs. That's the one book I've written. I've added a little bit about the Nazi UFOs. But I'm not really an alien researcher or a UFO researcher, although I have friends that are. And in other words, there's so much information and there's so little, I guess what you call answers, that what relevance is this information? You know, is it relevant to anything at all? Now, it may be very relevant to a person who's had a traumatic experience, and they have to seek this out, and that's understandable. But what is the relevance of information? Who are you? What are you doing? And some people are just whores for information. They just collect information as if they were collecting, as if they were a playboy and they were collecting girlfriends or phone numbers.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do?
They don't do anything with it. They don't do anything with it.
Well, exactly. Exactly. And I'm saying is in terms of the analogy I just used with collecting phone numbers of women or girlfriends, what does it do? Building up your ego? Eventually, you're going to want to find one woman, if you're, you know, typical of this society, and you're going to want to have children and build a life, to use one particular analogy, which may not be the best analogy, but, you know, you want to do something with, rather than just collect information. In other words, and anybody has to go out and sample information, find out who they are, what they are, and what are they doing. And I think that a lot of that stems from people not really understanding who or what they are, and they're searching. And it's, you know, it's okay to search. Sometimes the searches go on too long. Sometimes the searches are a whole lifetime of searching and never finding anything because they were just curious and they weren't directed or driven towards a specific goal. And in that case, I would tell people to find out not only who or what they are, but find out what they're here to do. What is their goal? And maybe they don't belong studying this information, or maybe they do.
Because I think people get distracted with it. That's my own personal opinion. We have to say goodbye. We're out of time, and I want to thank you so much for spending an hour of your evening with me. It's been very enjoyable, and I hope my listeners have enjoyed it just as much as I have. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining me.
You're welcome. It went by fast.